The streets of New York in the early 20th century were alive with a chaotic energy, a city pulsing with ambition, desperation, and the invisible currents of power. Immigrants poured into the boroughs carrying with them dreams of opportunity and the heavy burdens of poverty. In the shadow of skyscrapers and tenements, gangs carved their territories, ruled not by law but by force, fear, and the tenuous loyalties of men who lived and died by the gun. Crime was everywhere, yet it was fragmented, chaotic, and brutal, an untamed wilderness where power shifted with each violent encounter. Amid this storm of chaos, one man emerged, quietly observing, calculating, and preparing to reshape the rules of the game. This man was Charles Lucky Luciano, a figure whose name would become synonymous not just with the mafia but with the very idea of organized crime in America. Luciano's rise was not heralded by fanfare or public recognition. He did not seize power with the bluster of a gangster movie villain. He maneuvered through the shadows with precision, patience, and an almost surgical understanding of human nature. He saw opportunity where others saw only survival, and he understood that true power was never about brute force. Allenite was about strategy, alliances, and the careful orchestration of fear and loyalty. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano was not satisfied with being a foot soldier or a mid-level operator in the criminal underworld. He harbored ambitions that stretched beyond the streets of Brooklyn, beyond New York City itself, envisioning an empire that could survive, adapt, and thrive regardless of law enforcement pressure or internecine gang wars. At the core of Luciano's genius was his ability to read people, to anticipate reactions, and to manipulate events without ever exposing himself to unnecessary risk. He understood that chaos, when harnessed correctly, could become an instrument of power. Rival gangs were not just enemies, they were chess pieces, potential allies, and sometimes unwitting pawns in a game that only he fully comprehended. His early life in the tough neighborhoods of Brooklyn had honed this instinct. Surrounded by poverty, discrimination, and the harsh realities of immigrant life, Luciano had learned lessons that would serve him throughout his rise: the importance of respect, the fragility of trust, and the brutal consequences of miscalculation. But Luciano's story is not only one of ambition and criminal mastery, it is a story that reveals the psychological complexity behind the facade of the tough guy. He was by all accounts charming and disarming when necessary, capable of kindness and cruelty in equal measure. He recognized that fear alone could not sustain loyalty, and that respect often required a delicate balance between generosity and intimidation. His charisma was subtle but undeniable, drawing men toward him not just because they feared him but because they believed in the vision he offered, a vision of order amidst chaos, of profitability amidst disorder, and of personal elevation amidst the struggle for survival. The era into which Luciano rose was one of seismic change. Prohibition had unleashed a torrent of opportunity for those willing to operate outside the law, but it had also intensified competition, violence, and corruption. The mafia, fragmented into warring factions, lacked centralized leadership, and the American criminal landscape was rife with treachery and short-lived alliances. In this environment, power was transient and survival often depended on a combination of luck, cunning, and timing. Luciano, who would later earn the ironic nickname Lucky, understood this intimately. He knew that fortune favored not just the bold but the calculated, the patient, and the psychologically astute. His early exploits on the streets of Brooklyn were small tests of his instincts, lessons in navigating the dangerous intersection of lawlessness and opportunity, and stepping stones toward a larger, more audacious vision. This introduction is more than the story of a man. It is the story of a transformation, a shift in the very nature of organized crime in America. Luciano did not invent the mafia, but he reshaped it, turning it from a collection of violent street gangs into a coordinated enterprise that mirrored legitimate business structures. He brought a level of professionalism, strategy, and psychological sophistication that had been largely absent from the underworld. By the time he reached the peak of his power, Luciano had created a system in which loyalty was enforceable, betrayal was punishable, and profits could be maximized without constant bloodshed. He had turned chaos into order and ambition into empire. As this story unfolds, it becomes clear that Lucky Luciano's life is not merely a chronicle of crime, it is a study in human ambition, psychological insight, and the exercise of power in its most primal and sophisticated forms. To understand him is to understand the interplay between fear and respect, chaos and order, brutality and cunning. It is to peer into the mind of a man who operated not in headlines but in shadows, yet whose influence would ripple through history, forever changing the landscape of organized crime in America. The stage is set, the city teeming with opportunity and peril, and the man who would quietly yet irrevocably alter its criminal underworld is poised to step forward. Before Lucky Luciano rose to dominance, New York's criminal underworld was a fractured and chaotic landscape, a city divided by ethnicity, turf, and a volatile mix of ambition and desperation. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other immigrant gangs vied for control over neighborhoods, docks, and illicit trades, each operating with its own rules and traditions. Violence was not only common, it was the language of authority. Turf wars erupted over gambling dens, speakeasies, and protection rackets, often leaving streets Soaked in blood and fear in these years, organized crime had yet to evolve into the sophisticated hierarchical enterprise that Luciano would later create. Instead, it was raw, fragmented, and chaotic, a brutal reflection of the social and economic pressures of the time. The Italian-American mafia of the early 20th century was far from the monolithic organization portrayed in films and popular culture. It was a collection of loosely connected families, each led by a capo regime or local boss, often more concerned with asserting dominance over rivals than with profitability or long-term strategy. Violence was both a tool and a spectacle. Assassinations, drive-by shootings, and street brawls were regular occurrences, and the cycle of retaliation seemed endless. While these gangs were undeniably powerful in their neighborhoods, their influence was limited, their operations inefficient, and their leadership often short-sighted. In essence, the mafia was a collection of fiefdoms prone to infighting and unable to capitalize fully on the opportunities presented by the rapidly changing social and economic landscape of America. New York's underworld was also shaped by the broader forces of the era. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, created a vast black market for alcohol, unleashing unprecedented wealth and opportunity for those willing to operate outside the law. Speakeasies proliferated, and the demand for liquor transformed small-time operators into influential figures almost overnight. Yet with opportunity came competition, and competition bred violence. Gangs fought viciously over distribution networks, shipping routes, and protection rackets. The era's legal authorities were often corruptible, but they were far from predictable, making every expansion or maneuver a high-stakes gamble. It was in this environment that Luciano first observed the potential for a more organized, systematic approach to crime, one that could transcend ethnic boundaries, reduce internal bloodshed, and maximize profits. The social and cultural context of the time amplified the disorder. Many neighborhoods were overcrowded, impoverished, and ignored by law enforcement. Police often turned a blind eye to crime in immigrant districts, either out of corruption, fear, or sheer incapacity. Meanwhile, political machines like Tammany Hall exploited the immigrant population for votes, further entangling crime, politics, and economics. Gangs thrived in this environment, yet their success was unstable and contingent on local alliances, personal loyalties, and the unpredictable tides of violence. The underworld was simultaneously powerful and fragile, a contradiction that would soon be exploited by those clever enough to see the opportunity. The psychological landscape of the pre-Luciano mafia was defined by survival and brute force rather than strategy or long-term vision. Loyalty was enforced through intimidation and fear, and betrayal was often met with immediate and lethal consequences. There was no central authority, no council to mediate disputes or coordinate operations, and no system for ensuring that violence did not spiral into mutual destruction. The result was a volatile, unpredictable world where even small missteps could have fatal consequences. For many gangsters, ambition was measured in terms of territory, notoriety, or reputation, not sustainable power or financial gain. This environment produced figures who were fierce and charismatic, but ultimately short-sighted, prone to impulsive decisions that led to premature downfall. The contrast between this chaos and the vision that Luciano would later bring could not have been starker. While the underworld was fragmented, violent, and tribal, Luciano envisioned a different model, one based on organization, hierarchy, and strategic alliances. He saw the potential to unite rival factions under a central authority, reduce internecine warfare, and create a system that treated crime as a business rather than a series of random acts of violence. In his mind, order could emerge from chaos if power were concentrated, loyalty were formalized, and strategy replaced impulsiveness. Where others saw gangs, he saw an opportunity to construct a criminal empire that could survive for generations. Even before he began consolidating power, Luciano's awareness of the underworld's weaknesses shaped his early decisions. He observed that many rival bosses were emotionally reactive, guided more by pride and anger than by logic. They mismanaged resources, underestimated enemies, and allowed personal vendettas to dictate strategy. Luciano, in contrast, approached the same environment with cold calculation, patience, and psychological acuity. He understood the delicate balance between fear and respect, violence and diplomacy. He recognized that a single well-placed alliance could accomplish what months of street warfare could not, and that influence, not just intimidation, was the key to sustainable power. This era, with all its violence and instability, set the stage for Luciano's rise. It created a fertile ground for innovation, rewarding those who could think strategically and manipulate both people and circumstances to their advantage. The chaos of the pre-Luciano underworld was not merely a backdrop, it was a proving ground, a crucible in which the skills, instincts, and ambition of the future mafia kingpin would be forged. By understanding the flaws and vulnerabilities of this fragmented system, Luciano would later exploit them, transforming not only his own fortunes but the very nature of organized Crime in America. In retrospect, the world before Luciano was a testament to the limitations of power. Without vision, violence, fear and territoriality could secure short-term dominance, but they could not create enduring empires. The stage was set for a man who could see beyond the immediate, who could blend diplomacy with intimidation, psychology with strategy, and ambition with pragmatism. This was the world into which Lucky Luciano stepped, not to merely survive but to dominate, reshape and define the future of organized crime in ways that no one before him could have imagined. Brooklyn in the early 1900s was a cauldron of opportunity and hardship, a place where the promise of the American dream collided violently with the realities of poverty and prejudice. It was here, amid crowded tenements and narrow streets, that Charles Lucky Luciano was born into a world that demanded toughness, cunning and relentless ambition. The son of Sicilian immigrants, he grew up in a neighborhood where survival was a daily negotiation and respect could mean the difference between life and death. Luciano's childhood was shaped by the twin forces of deprivation and aspiration, two poles that would define his character for the rest of his life. On one hand, he witnessed firsthand the struggles of immigrant families struggling to survive. On the other, he glimpsed the rewards available to those bold enough to seize power, even if the price was moral compromise. From a young age, Luciano displayed an unusual combination of intelligence and street savvy. He was quick to learn the unspoken codes that governed his environment, which streets were safe, which figures commanded fear, and which alliances could be exploited for advantage. He absorbed lessons not from books but from observation, listening to the whispers of the streets and studying the behavior of those who wielded power effectively. Already he understood that the world did not reward mere hard work, it rewarded those who could manipulate circumstances, anticipate threats and project both respect and fear. These early lessons in human behavior and social dynamics were formative, providing the psychological foundation for the empire he would later build. Yet Luciano's early life was not only about observation, it was also about testing boundaries and claiming space in a world that was often hostile to young men like him. The streets of Brooklyn were unforgiving and opportunities were scarce. Many of his peers fell victim to violence, poverty, or the lure of petty crime without ever ascending beyond their immediate circumstances. Luciano, however, seemed to instinctively understand the difference between short-term survival and long-term ambition. Where others reacted impulsively to challenges, he analyzed, calculated, and planned his next move. His early scrapes with law enforcement and local gangs were not merely youthful indiscretions, they were exercises in understanding power, human psychology, and the consequences of risk. Education played a paradoxical role in shaping Luciano. Though formal schooling was limited and often interrupted, he possessed an unusual curiosity and mental agility. He absorbed knowledge wherever he could, from newspapers detailing gang conflicts to streetwise lessons about influence and manipulation. He learned to read people, to detect weakness and ambition alike, and to assess the value of potential allies and rivals. This combination of street education and innate intelligence allowed him to navigate a world where rules were flexible, morality was negotiable, and opportunity was often hidden behind layers of danger and deceit. Luciano's teenage years were marked by a growing awareness of the social hierarchies around him. He recognized that power in Brooklyn was less about brute strength and more about strategy, alliances, and the careful management of loyalty and fear. Unlike other young men who sought notoriety through public acts of violence or intimidation, Luciano was patient, preferring to observe and build influence quietly. This patience was both a psychological strength and a tactical advantage, allowing him to learn from the mistakes of others while positioning himself for future ascendancy. In these formative years, the seeds of his philosophy were sown, that power was best exercised not through chaos alone but through calculated manipulation, disciplined organization, and strategic vision. Family and community dynamics also influenced his development. As the son of Sicilian immigrants, he was steeped in cultural traditions that emphasized respect, honor, and loyalty, yet he also witnessed the limitations of these codes when applied rigidly. Many families in his neighborhood struggled to survive under oppressive social and economic conditions, and the temptation to exploit or bend these codes for personal gain was constant. Luciano internalized these lessons, learning to navigate the tension between moral expectation and practical advantage. This duality between inherited values and pragmatic self-interest would become a defining feature of his character, allowing him to project loyalty while pursuing his own ambitious ends. By his late teens, Luciano had begun to step beyond petty theft and street fights. Entering the early stages of organized criminal activity, he gravitated toward groups that operated with a semblance of hierarchy and strategy, testing his ability to influence others and assert his presence. These early forays were critical in teaching him the nuances of negotiation, intimidation, and alliance building. He quickly realized that leadership was less about fear alone and more about the perception of intelligence, confidence, and reliability. Those who could command respect without constant violence held an advantage, and Luciano was determined to cultivate this form of influence. It was also during these years that Luciano developed a keen awareness of timing and opportunity. He observed the ebb and flow of gang rivalries, noting when to strike, when to withdraw, and when to cultivate alliances. He learned that impulsive aggression could undermine long-term objectives, while patience and subtlety often yielded greater rewards. This capacity to think several steps ahead distinguished him from his peers, who were often reactive and short-sighted. Luciano's emerging strategic mind would later become the cornerstone of his success, allowing him to orchestrate complex networks of crime while avoiding the pitfalls that destroyed so many contemporaries. Psychologically, Luciano demonstrated a remarkable ability to manage dualities. He could be ruthless yet charming, calculating yet personable, manipulative yet seemingly loyal. He understood that the human psyche could be both a weapon and a vulnerability, and he exploited this insight to create influence and authority that extended beyond his immediate physical strength. In the crucible of Brooklyn's streets, these psychological skills were not abstract theories, they were tools for survival, influence, and ultimately empire building. By the time he reached adulthood, Luciano had evolved from a streetwise youth into a figure capable of envisioning and executing complex schemes that transcended the local neighborhood. His ambition was no longer reactive, it was proactive, strategic, and deeply informed by the lessons of his environment. He had seen the limits of violence without organization, the fragility of alliances without strategy, and the power of perception in commanding respect. These insights set the stage for the next phase of his life, the calculated rise from street-level hustler to architect of a new kind of criminal empire, one that would redefine the American mafia and leave an indelible mark on history. In essence, the streets of Brooklyn had forged Luciano into more than a survivor, they had shaped him into a visionary strategist, a man attuned to the psychological currents of power and ambition. Where others saw only the chaos of the underworld, he saw opportunity. Where others reacted with fear or anger, he calculated, planned, and executed. The foundation of his empire was laid not through luck alone but through a combination of intelligence, observation, and a deep understanding of the human condition. The boy from Brooklyn was no longer merely a participant in the street's brutal theater, was preparing to become its director, shaping its future with a vision that few could anticipate and even fewer could challenge. As Luciano transitioned from the streets of Brooklyn into the wider world of organized crime, he began learning lessons that could not be taught in schools or formal settings. These were lessons of survival, influence, and the subtle art of power, lessons that would shape him into a figure capable of bending both men and circumstances to his will. It was in this crucible of trial and error that Luciano discovered the importance of mentorship, strategic alliances, and careful observation, each element a cornerstone in his emerging understanding of leadership and dominance. Luciano's early mentors were men who already commanded respect in Brooklyn's criminal underworld, seasoned operators who combined street violence with tactical intelligence. They recognized the potential in him, a boy with audacity, mental acuity, and an instinctive sense of human behavior, and began to guide him, often in unconventional ways. These mentors exposed him to the mechanics of protection rackets, illegal gambling operations, and the distribution networks that funneled money from the streets to the hands of those daring enough to organize it. But mentorship was never simple. Each lesson came with implicit tests of loyalty, intelligence, and courage. Luciano had to navigate these tests carefully, balancing respect for authority with the cultivation of his own independent strategy. Early in his career, Luciano was exposed to the brutal consequences of miscalculation, a single failed negotiation, a mistimed act of violence, or a misjudged alliance could and often did end lives. He watched peers rise and fall almost overnight, their fates dictated by impulsive decisions or misplaced trust. These experiences honed his instinct for timing and precision, teaching him that survival required both intelligence and restraint. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano learned that fear alone could command obedience temporarily, but respect, calculated alliances, and foresight created sustainable influence. He began to internalize a philosophy that would guide his every move. Power was a blend of perception, strategy, and the careful orchestration of loyalty and fear. Luciano's early criminal ventures were simultaneously practical exercises and psychological experiments. He engaged in street-level hustles, petty thefts, and small-time extortion, each offering lessons in risk assessment, negotiation, and the management of human behavior. In these activities, he observed the dynamics of cooperation and betrayal, noting who could be trusted and who would falter under pressure. These experiences were formative, providing insight not just into the mechanics of crime but into the intricate motivations and weaknesses of the men around him. Luciano began to understand that a well-placed alliance could achieve more than brute force, and that the perception of power was sometimes more important than its actual exercise. Strategic thinking became a hallmark of his approach. Early on, Luciano observed the rivalries that tore apart other gangs. Noting how personal pride, impulsive violence and short-sighted decisions undermined long-term ambitions, he internalized a critical distinction: while street-level dominance could be achieved through aggression, lasting authority required foresight, organization and psychological acuity. He began to cultivate a style of leadership that combined charm, intimidation and subtle influence, a method that allowed him to maneuver within dangerous networks while avoiding unnecessary exposure to risk where others relied solely on muscle. Luciano relied on observation, timing, and the careful calibration of alliances. The world of mentorship also exposed Luciano to the complex interplay of loyalty and betrayal. In the early stages of his career, he witnessed acts of treachery that destroyed powerful figures overnight, yet he also saw examples of loyalty rewarded, networks reinforced, and influence expanded through subtle negotiation. These lessons became deeply ingrained. He realized that power was not just a matter of command but a psychological negotiation, a constant balancing act between trust and suspicion, generosity and intimidation. This understanding would later allow him to consolidate control over rival factions in ways that seemed almost effortless to outsiders. Luciano's early experiences also taught him the importance of discretion. The flashy, impulsive violence that characterized many of his contemporaries attracted attention from law enforcement and rival gangs alike. Luciano understood that visibility could be dangerous. Influence was most potent when wielded quietly through carefully cultivated networks and subtle psychological manipulation. He began to operate with a calculated invisibility, projecting power through reputation and strategic action rather than spectacle. In doing so, he learned to move in the shadows, to anticipate threats before they materialized, and to position himself as both a respected and feared figure without drawing unnecessary scrutiny. These formative years also revealed the psychological dimensions of power and crime. Luciano was not merely interested in financial gain, he was fascinated by the mechanics of influence, the ways in which fear, respect and loyalty could be harnessed to achieve objectives. He studied the behavior of rivals and allies alike, noting patterns, vulnerabilities and tendencies. He learned that timing, perception and subtlety often outweighed brute force, and that the most effective leaders were those who could shape events without exposing themselves to direct conflict. In this sense, Luciano was as much a psychologist as he was a gangster, understanding that controlling the minds of men was just as critical as controlling the streets. By the time Luciano began to move beyond the lower ranks of organized crime, he had accumulated not only practical skills but also an extraordinary understanding of human nature. He could read intentions, anticipate betrayal, and exploit weaknesses while simultaneously fostering loyalty. He had mastered the art of negotiation, the subtle exercise of influence, and the psychological architecture of fear and respect. These skills would prove indispensable as he began to construct his vision of a modern, organized and enduring criminal empire. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's early trials forged a strategic patience that would define his later career. He learned to wait for the right moment to act, to consolidate alliances before making bold moves, and to understand that ambition without preparation often led to disaster. He saw firsthand how impulsive decisions and unchecked pride destroyed potential empires, and he resolved to chart a different course, one defined by calculation, foresight, and the deliberate orchestration of both people and events. In these early years, then, Luciano was not simply surviving, was learning, observing, and shaping himself into a figure capable of transcending the chaos of Brooklyn's streets. He transformed adversity into opportunity, mistakes into lessons, and observation into strategy. By the time he fully entered the ranks of organized crime, he was not merely another ambitious youth seeking quick profits. He was a calculating strategist, a student of human psychology, and a man preparing to redefine the very structure of criminal power in America. The streets that had tested him, the mentors who had guided him, and the early experiments in crime had all combined to produce a figure uniquely equipped for leadership. Lucky Luciano was no longer just a streetwise boy from Brooklyn. He was an emerging architect of a criminal revolution, one who understood that true power was the ability to bend both circumstances and men to one's will. His early trials had forged the tools he would later use to construct an empire, and the lessons he learned would echo throughout the underworld for decades to come. As Luciano transitioned from the streets of Brooklyn into the wider world of organized crime, he began learning lessons that could not be taught in schools or formal settings. These were lessons of survival, influence, and the subtle art of power, lessons that would shape him into a figure capable of bending both men and circumstances to his will. It was in this crucible of trial and error that Luciano discovered the importance of mentorship, strategic alliances, and careful observation, each element a cornerstone in his emerging understanding of leadership and dominance. Luciano's early mentors were men who already commanded respect in Brooklyn's criminal underworld, seasoned operators who combined street violence with tactical intelligence. They recognized the potential in him, a boy with audacity, mental acuity, and an instinctive sense of human behavior, and began to guide him, often in unconventional ways. These mentors exposed him to the mechanics of protection rackets, illegal gambling operations, and the distribution networks that funneled money from the streets to the hands of those daring enough to organize it. But mentorship was never simple. Each lesson came with implicit tests of loyalty, intelligence, and courage. Luciano had to navigate these tests, carefully balancing respect for authority with the cultivation of his own independent strategy. Early in his career, Luciano was exposed to the brutal consequences of miscalculation: a single failed negotiation, a mistimed act of violence, or a misjudged alliance could and often did end lives. He watched peers rise and fall almost overnight, their fates dictated by impulsive decisions or misplaced trust. These experiences honed his instinct for timing and precision, teaching him that survival required both intelligence and restraint. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano learned that fear alone could command obedience temporarily, but respect, calculated alliances, and foresight created sustainable influence. He began to internalize a philosophy that would guide his every move. Power was a blend of perception, strategy, and the careful orchestration of loyalty and fear. Luciano's early criminal ventures were simultaneously practical exercises and psychological experiments. He engaged in street-level hustles, petty thefts, and small-time extortion, each offering lessons in risk assessment, negotiation, and the management of human behavior. In these activities, he observed the dynamics of cooperation and betrayal, noting who could be trusted and who would falter under pressure. These experiences were formative, providing insight not just into the mechanics of crime but into the intricate motivations and weaknesses of the men around him. Luciano began to understand that a well-placed alliance could achieve more than brute force, and that the perception of power was sometimes more important than its actual exercise. Strategic thinking became a hallmark of his approach. Early on, Luciano observed the rivalries that tore apart other gangs. Noting how personal pride, impulsive violence, and short-sighted decisions undermined long-term ambitions, he internalized a critical distinction: while street-level dominance could be achieved through aggression, lasting authority required foresight, organization, and psychological acuity. He began to cultivate a style of leadership that combined charm, intimidation, and subtle influence, a method that allowed him to maneuver within dangerous networks while avoiding unnecessary exposure to risk where others relied solely on muscle. Luciano relied on observation, timing, and the careful calibration of alliances. The world of mentorship also exposed Luciano to the complex interplay of loyalty and betrayal. In the early stages of his career, he witnessed acts of treachery that destroyed powerful figures overnight, yet he also saw examples of loyalty rewarded, networks reinforced, and influence expanded through subtle negotiation. These lessons became deeply ingrained. He realized that power was not just a matter of command but a psychological negotiation, a constant balancing act between trust and suspicion, generosity and intimidation. This understanding would later allow him to consolidate control over rival factions in ways that seemed almost effortless to outsiders. Luciano's early experiences also taught him the importance of discretion. The flashy, impulsive violence that characterized many of his contemporaries attracted attention from law enforcement and rival gangs alike. Luciano understood that visibility could be dangerous. Influence was most potent when wielded quietly through carefully cultivated networks and subtle psychological manipulation. He began to operate with a calculated invisibility, projecting power through reputation and strategic action rather than spectacle. In doing so, he learned to move in the shadows, to anticipate threats before they materialized, and to position himself as both a respected and feared figure without drawing unnecessary scrutiny. These formative years also revealed the psychological dimensions of power and crime. Luciano was not merely interested in financial gain. He was fascinated by the mechanics of influence, the ways in which fear, respect, and loyalty could be harnessed to achieve objectives. He studied the behavior of rivals and allies alike, noting patterns, vulnerabilities, and tendencies. He learned that timing, perception, and subtlety often outweighed brute force, and that the most effective leaders were those who could shape events without exposing themselves to direct conflict. In this sense, Luciano was as much a psychologist as he was a gangster, understanding that controlling the minds of men was just as critical as controlling the streets. By the time Luciano began to move beyond the lower ranks of organized crime, he had accumulated not only practical skills but also an extraordinary understanding of human nature. He could read intentions, anticipate betrayal, and exploit weaknesses while simultaneously fostering loyalty. He had mastered the art of negotiation, the subtle exercise of influence, and the psychological architecture of fear and respect. These skills would prove indispensable as he began to construct his vision of a modern, organized, and enduring criminal empire. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's early trials forged a strategic patience that would define his later career. He learned to wait for the right moment to act, to consolidate alliances before making bold moves, and to understand that ambition without preparation often led to disaster. He saw firsthand how impulsive decisions and unchecked pride destroyed potential empires, and he resolved to chart a different course, one defined by calculation, foresight, and the deliberate orchestration of both people and events. In these early years, then, Luciano was not simply surviving, was learning, observing, and shaping himself into a figure capable of transcending the chaos of Brooklyn's streets. He transformed adversity into opportunity, mistakes into lessons, and observation into strategy. By the time he fully entered the ranks of organized crime, he was not merely another ambitious youth seeking quick profits. He was a calculating strategist, a student of human psychology, and a man preparing to redefine the very structure of criminal power in America. The streets that had tested him, the mentors who had guided him, and the early experiments in crime had all combined to produce a figure uniquely equipped for leadership. Lucky Luciano was no longer just a streetwise boy from Brooklyn. He was an emerging architect of a criminal revolution, one who understood that true power was the ability to bend both circumstances and men to one's will. His early trials had forged the tools he would later use to construct an empire, and the lessons he learned would echo throughout the underworld for decades to come. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had not only consolidated alliances and established a hierarchical structure within the mafia, but he had also begun to revolutionize the very business of crime itself. In an era defined by prohibition and the rapid expansion of urban centers, illegal enterprise offered unprecedented opportunity, yet it remained poorly organized and often violent. Luciano recognized that the old model of crime, spontaneous, territorial, and reactionary, was inefficient. Profit and influence could be maximized not through chaos but through careful management, strategic partnerships, and the disciplined exploitation of opportunity. The foundation of Luciano's criminal business was prohibition, the nationwide ban on alcohol that had created a black market of staggering scale. Speakeasies, bootlegging operations, and illicit distilleries flourished in every borough, offering enormous potential for those bold enough to seize it. Luciano saw beyond the immediate profits. He saw the opportunity to systematize operations, control distribution networks, and integrate various factions under a single coordinated framework. He understood that the real power lay not merely in supplying alcohol but in controlling the infrastructure that transported, stored, and distributed it, ensuring both efficiency and security. Luciano's approach to bootlegging was methodical. Rather than relying solely on brute force to control territory, he combined intimidation with strategic negotiation. Rival factions were often co-opted into the network either through profit-sharing arrangements or carefully brokered agreements that minimized violence and maximized efficiency. The result was a system in which competition became collaboration and criminal enterprise began to resemble legitimate business operations. In its sophistication, Luciano's genius lay in seeing crime not as chaos but as a logistical challenge, a problem of supply, demand, and human behavior that could be solved with strategy and foresight. Beyond alcohol, Luciano expanded into gambling, recognizing its universal appeal and the consistent flow of money it generated. Illegal gambling dens became both revenue sources and tools of influence. By controlling these operations, Luciano could fund other ventures, reward loyal associates, and exert leverage over politicians, law enforcement, and business owners. Gambling in his hands was more than a profit center. It was a psychological instrument, fostering dependence, loyalty, and fear in equal measure. The careful orchestration of odds, operations, and alliances created a system in which wealth was concentrated, influence extended, and rivals neutralized without the constant need for violence. Another critical element of Luciano's enterprise was his penetration of labor unions and legitimate businesses. Recognizing that power in America was not only about street control but also about economic leverage, he cultivated relationships with union leaders, business owners, and political figures. Through these connections, Luciano could manipulate contracts, influence labor strikes, and integrate legitimate revenue streams into his criminal network. This duality, operating simultaneously in the legal and illegal spheres, provided both insulation from law enforcement and additional channels for profit. Luciano's vision extended beyond immediate gain. He sought sustainable influence that could weather both political shifts and public scrutiny. The psychological sophistication of Luciano's business model cannot be overstated. He understood that money alone was insufficient to sustain loyalty. Men were motivated by perception, fear, opportunity, and ambition. By carefully distributing resources, cultivating dependence, and rewarding loyalty, he created a network that functioned with remarkable cohesion. Associates were not merely employees, they were participants in a larger, meticulously orchestrated system in which compliance and contribution were incentivized while betrayal carried severe consequences. In this way, Luciano's operations mirrored a corporate structure with incentives, penalties, and oversight designed to maintain efficiency and order. Luciano's ability to integrate various criminal enterprises was particularly revolutionary. Alcohol, gambling unions, and even minor rackets were not treated as isolated endeavors. They were components of a larger ecosystem. Profits flowed strategically from one venture to another. Resources were allocated according to operational priority, and influence was leveraged across Multiple domains. This holistic approach allowed Luciano to maintain control over a vast and complex network while minimizing risk. The underworld, once fragmented and chaotic, became a tightly managed enterprise under his guidance. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano understood the value of discretion and perception in business, unlike earlier gangsters who flaunted their wealth and influence, attracting both attention and law enforcement scrutiny. Luciano operated with calculated subtlety. His public profile was carefully managed, his operations shielded behind intermediaries and loyal lieutenants, and his presence felt more through influence than spectacle. By controlling perception, he enhanced his power while minimizing exposure, an approach that allowed the enterprise to thrive in the shadows while appearing almost invisible to outsiders. The era also tested Luciano's adaptability. Law enforcement, political pressures, and rival factions presented constant challenges, yet he treated these obstacles as strategic problems rather than insurmountable barriers. Corrupt officials were leveraged through bribes or favors, rival gangs were neutralized or absorbed, and logistical hurdles were addressed with planning and foresight. Luciano's ability to anticipate both opportunity and threat transformed the environment itself, bending circumstances to his advantage rather than reacting passively to them. The combination of strategic organization, diversified enterprise, psychological insight, and operational efficiency allowed Luciano to create wealth and influence on an unprecedented scale. He was no longer merely a street-level operator or ambitious gangster. He was a businessman, psychologist, and strategist capable of orchestrating a complex empire with multiple moving parts. In doing so, he not only expanded his personal power but also fundamentally redefined the nature of organized crime in America. The chaotic, violent underworld of the early 20th century was giving way to a sophisticated, integrated system, an enterprise that would endure far beyond his direct control. Luciano's model also carried profound social and political implications. By controlling unions, businesses, and public officials, he extended the reach of the criminal underworld into legitimate society, blurring the line between legality and illegality. His operations created networks of obligation, influence, and dependence that extended far beyond Brooklyn or Manhattan, making him a figure whose power could not be measured merely in street credibility or reputation. This integration of criminal and legitimate spheres allowed him to shape both economic and social landscapes, further solidifying his position at the apex of organized crime. Ultimately, Luciano's business of crime was a reflection of his broader philosophy. Power was not about chaos or raw strength, it was about vision, discipline, and psychological mastery. By transforming illegal trades into structured, efficient, and strategic enterprises, he demonstrated that organized crime could be a model of both financial and operational sophistication. His genius lay not in violence alone but in the orchestration of systems, the manipulation of human behavior, and the creation of an enduring empire that extended influence across social, economic, and political spheres. The underworld that had once been fragmented, reactive, and brutal was now streamlined, profitable, and strategically managed. The chaos of the streets had been converted into opportunity, structure, and influence, and Luciano stood at the center, the quiet architect of an empire whose methods would resonate for decades. Through alcohol, gambling, unions, and careful manipulation of human psychology, he had created not just wealth but control, an invisible power that would allow him to dominate the American mafia and by extension shape the very contours of crime and society in the 20th century. The power of Lucky Luciano was not built solely on wealth, strategy, or alliances. It was also founded on a deeply ingrained psychological code that governed loyalty, obedience, and the delicate balance between fear and respect. In the underworld where betrayal was often deadly and trust scarce, the code of Omertan, unspoken rule of silence, loyalty, and honor served as both a moral compass and a weapon for Luciano. Understanding, enforcing, and manipulating this code was as crucial as any strategic alliance or financial enterprise. Omerta was not merely a tradition, it was a framework that allowed the mafia to operate with discipline, cohesion, and an almost corporate efficiency. Despite its violent and illicit nature, Omerta demanded more than silence, it demanded total psychological alignment with the organization's rules, a submission that went beyond fear of punishment. Members were expected to act with loyalty, respect the chain of command, and place the interests of the family above personal ambition. Yet Luciano recognized that the code's power was not absolute. It required careful cultivation, strategic reinforcement, and at times the judicious application of intimidation. Loyalty could be nurtured or manipulated, and fear could be a motivator when balanced with opportunity. In this way, Omerta became a tool of psychological control, enabling Luciano to orchestrate complex operations with minimal disruption and maximum efficiency. The enforcement of Omerta was both subtle and absolute. Public displays of brutality were often reserved for those who betrayed the organization or threatened its stability, but for loyal members the code offered protection, opportunity, and advancement. Luciano understood that reward and punishment must be balanced. Fear alone would breed resentment or rebellion, while unchecked generosity could weaken authority. Through careful observation, he determined which men could be trusted, which required supervision and which posed existential threats by mastering this psychological calculus. Luciano could extend his influence across diverse factions, maintaining loyalty even among those who might otherwise be tempted to act against him. Omerta also provided a strategic advantage against law enforcement. Silence was a weapon, shielding operations from exposure and complicating investigations. Luciano's men understood that violating the code could be fatal, and the psychological weight of this understanding created a disciplined, self-regulating network. It was not merely compliance, it was the internalization of a system in which survival and success depended on adherence. The code created predictability within the chaos of criminal enterprise, allowing Luciano to focus on expansion, consolidation, and long-term strategy rather than constant crisis management. Psychologically, the code of Omerta operated on multiple levels. It instilled a sense of belonging, identity, and purpose within the organization, binding men not only through fear but through shared values and the promise of advancement. At the same time, it created a pervasive awareness of consequence, a constant reminder that betrayal or impulsive action could carry deadly repercussions. Luciano exploited this duality, reinforcing loyalty through opportunity, respect, and psychological insight, while simultaneously ensuring that fear remained an ever-present motivator. This delicate balance of trust and intimidation became a hallmark of his leadership style. Luciano's interpretation of Omerta was also pragmatic. He understood that the code could be bent, manipulated, or leveraged when necessary to serve broader strategic goals. Rival factions, law enforcement, and even his own lieutenants could be influenced through selective application of loyalty and fear. By understanding human psychology and the motivations underlying obedience, Luciano transformed Omerta from a cultural expectation into a tactical instrument. Men acted not only out of tradition or fear but because they recognized that alignment with his vision was both practical and profitable. The code also created a psychological hierarchy within the organization. Obedience to Omerta reinforced the chain of command, ensuring that strategic decisions flowed from the top and that operations were executed with precision. Loyalty was rewarded with power, influence, and access, while betrayal, whether overt or covert, was swiftly punished. This psychological architecture allowed Luciano to manage a complex and sprawling network of criminal enterprise, maintaining cohesion even as the organization expanded into multiple territories and sectors of illicit activity. Omerta was not static, it evolved alongside Luciano's empire as he expanded into gambling, bootlegging, labor unions, and other enterprises. The code adapted to new challenges and environments. The principles of loyalty, discretion, and obedience remained constant, but their application was tailored to circumstances, individuals, and objectives. This adaptability was critical, allowing Luciano to integrate diverse factions, navigate legal and political pressures, and manage complex financial operations without compromising the psychological cohesion of his organization. The cultural resonance of Omerta also enhanced its effectiveness for many Italian immigrants. The code was a familiar moral framework rooted in centuries of tradition and family loyalty. Luciano leveraged this shared understanding, embedding his authority within a broader cultural context that made disobedience not only dangerous but socially and psychologically alien. The result was a network in which compliance, loyalty, and obedience were reinforced both by fear of punishment and by cultural expectation, creating a self-sustaining system of control. In essence, Omerta allowed Luciano to extend his influence far beyond what physical force alone could achieve. It created predictability, loyalty, and psychological discipline in a world defined by unpredictability and violence. Through careful application of reward, intimidation, and strategic reinforcement, he ensured that men acted in alignment with his vision, often without direct oversight. It was an invisible infrastructure of power, a network of psychological levers that amplified his authority and enabled the management of an empire that spanned multiple criminal sectors. Luciano's mastery of Omerta was not merely administrative, it was profoundly psychological. He understood that obedience, loyalty, and silence were not just tactical requirements, they were human behaviors that could be shaped, guided, and exploited. By reading intentions, anticipating responses, and manipulating perception, he created a system in which the organization functioned efficiently, cohesively, and resiliently. In this sense, Omerta became both a moral and a strategic instrument, one that allowed him to maintain control, influence behavior, and expand his empire with minimal disruption. Ultimately, the Code of Omerta exemplifies the unique combination of psychology, strategy, and cultural insight that defined Luciano's leadership. It was more than a set of rules, it was a philosophy of power, a framework for managing human behavior, and a tool for sustaining authority across a complex and often chaotic criminal landscape. By mastering this code, Luciano ensured that loyalty was enforceable, betrayal was costly, and influence extended far beyond the visible reach of violence or wealth. In the hands of Lucky Luciano, Omerta was not just a tradition, it was a weapon, a shield, and a foundation for one of the most sophisticated criminal empires in history. Even the most meticulously constructed empire is never immune to threats, and for Lucky Luciano the consolidation of power brought with it an entirely new dimension of danger: enemies, betrayals, and the constant negotiation of a fragile balance of power. By the 1930s, Luciano's rise had not gone unnoticed. Rival mobsters, both ambitious and resentful, viewed him as a threat to their own influence. Law enforcement, increasingly aware of the sophisticated networks he commanded, began to scrutinize the operations that had previously existed in shadows, and within his own ranks the potential for treachery driven by ambition, greed, or resentment loomed as a constant hazard. The underworld, despite the stability Luciano had engineered, remained a place where loyalty was conditional and betrayal was both sudden and lethal. The first challenge was external: rival factions, some historically entrenched and others newly ambitious, sought to test Luciano's authority. Italian mafia families entrenched in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and beyond had long adhered to traditions of territorial autonomy. Many were skeptical of the centralized vision Luciano proposed, resistant to his attempts to unify disparate factions under coordinated operations. At the same time, Jewish, Irish, and other criminal enterprises recognized the potential for disruption in the alliances he was forging. Luciano's approach was strategic. He leveraged diplomacy, psychological insight, and selective intimidation to neutralize opposition. He offered incentives to potential rivals, negotiated mutually beneficial arrangements, and when necessary demonstrated that resistance would carry catastrophic consequences. Betrayal, however, was never limited to external rivals. Within the hierarchy he had constructed, there were always men tempted by personal gain or dissatisfied with their position. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to anticipate such threats before they materialized. He maintained a network of observation, ensuring that he had advance warning of disloyalty or insubordination. Strategic placement of trusted lieutenants allowed him to monitor behavior, assess intent, and intervene preemptively. By combining human intelligence with psychological acuity, he could neutralize betrayal before it escalated, often turning potential adversaries into a laser, eliminating them without attracting unnecessary attention. The interplay of fear and respect was central to maintaining this balance of power. Luciano understood that neither force alone nor charm alone could sustain loyalty. Men needed to fear the consequences of disobedience but also respect the strategic brilliance of their leader. This duality allowed him to manage rival factions and internal threats alike. Those who respected his vision were motivated to align their actions with organizational objectives, while those who underestimated him or contemplated betrayal were reminded, sometimes violently, sometimes subtly, that his influence was both pervasive and precise. In this way, the psychological structure of his empire mirrored its organizational one: calculated, layered, and resilient. The underworld was also defined by constant negotiation and shifting alliances. Deals could be struck one day and broken the next, often influenced by circumstance, greed, or opportunism. Luciano navigated these treacherous waters with a combination of foresight, diplomacy, and strategic ruthlessness. He recognized that alliances were rarely permanent and power was never absolute. Instead, he treated relationships as dynamic systems capable of adjustment, manipulation, and realignment according to evolving circumstances. This flexibility allowed him to maintain control in an environment where rigidity often led to destruction. Violence remained an ever-present tool, but Luciano wielded it selectively. Unlike the impulsive aggression of earlier gang leaders, he used force strategically as a psychological instrument to reinforce loyalty, deter rivals, and assert authority. Executions, beatings, or disappearances were carefully calculated, timed, and communicated to send clear messages without provoking unnecessary retaliation. Violence in his hands was not merely reactive, it was orchestrated, precise, and instrumental in maintaining the delicate equilibrium of power. Law enforcement added another layer of complexity to this balance. The 1930s saw increased scrutiny of organized crime driven by both public outrage and political pressure. Corruption, once a reliable shield, became less predictable, and federal authorities began coordinating investigations into mafia operations. Luciano, however, demonstrated remarkable adaptability. He cultivated relationships with key officials, leveraged bribes and influence, and developed contingency plans to shield operations from exposure. By combining strategic diplomacy with operational secrecy, he maintained the stability of his empire despite mounting external pressure. The psychological tension of this era was immense. Luciano operated in a world where the cost of misjudgment was literal: life and death. Every alliance carried risk, every interaction was laden with potential deception, and every expansion or negotiation had to be measured against both immediate gain and long-term stability. This constant vigilance, this relentless calculation defined his leadership and set him apart from contemporaries who were often reactive, impulsive, or blinded by ambition. His ability to maintain clarity amidst chaos became a defining feature of his rise. Betrayal could come from the most unexpected quarters. Associates who had been loyal for years could suddenly turn opportunistic, influenced by greed, fear, or promises from rivals. Luciano's countermeasure was a combination of psychological profiling, strategic incentives, and controlled intimidation. He understood that loyalty was not innate, it had to be earned, maintained, and occasionally tested. By structuring both rewards and consequences, he created a self-regulating system in which the risk of betrayal was minimized and the benefits of alignment were maximized. Even the balance of power between families required constant attention. No single faction could dominate without generating resentment, yet dominance was necessary to maintain order and profitability. Luciano's approach was to cultivate interdependence. By linking the success of rival factions to the broader success of the network, he created a system in which collaboration became more advantageous than conflict. Strategic marriages, shared operations, and mutually beneficial agreements became tools for maintaining equilibrium, turning potential adversaries into stakeholders in the stability of his empire. At its core, this period of Luciano's life illustrates the delicate interplay between ambition, strategy, and psychology. His empire was not maintained solely by brute force, wealth, or fear. It was upheld by a nuanced understanding of human behavior, the management of relationships, and the orchestration of both internal and external dynamics. By anticipating threats, neutralizing rivals, and reinforcing loyalty through both reward and intimidation, Luciano created a system in which the complex web of criminal enterprise could function efficiently, predictably, and sustainably. Ultimately, the challenges of enemies, betrayal, and the balance of power defined the sophistication of Luciano's leadership. He transformed the mafia from a chaotic collection of warring factions into a coordinated, hierarchical, and resilient organization capable of withstanding internal and external pressures. This ability to manage human behavior, negotiate shifting alliances, and apply strategic violence elevated him beyond mere gangster to master architect of power. It was this delicate equilibrium maintained through foresight, diplomacy, and psychological acuity that allowed Lucky Luciano to ascend to the apex of organized crime, a position in which he could dominate not only territories and profits but the very culture and structure of the American mafia. Even the most carefully orchestrated empires are vulnerable to forces beyond strategy and control, and for Lucky Luciano, the cracks in his seemingly invincible reign began to appear in the late 1930s. His rise had been marked by calculated alliances, psychological mastery, and unprecedented control over the American underworld. Yet with great power came great exposure. As his operations grew in scale and complexity, the very structures that had allowed him to dominate also created vulnerabilities. A single misstep, a moment of overconfidence, or the shifting tides of loyalty could and eventually would endanger the empire he had built with ruthless precision. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Law enforcement agencies, emboldened by public outrage and political pressure, began targeting organized crime with increasing intensity. Federal authorities, once easily bribed or evaded, developed more sophisticated strategies, pooling intelligence and leveraging coordinated investigations that crossed city and state lines. The media, ever hungry for sensational stories, amplified the risks by highlighting mafia activities, turning public opinion against figures like Luciano and creating an environment in which political intervention became unavoidable. The very visibility of his empire, previously a source of power, now threatened to unravel it. Internal vulnerability was equally perilous. The network Luciano had built relied on human loyalty, a variable inherently difficult to control. Even with omerta, enforced ambition, fear, and opportunism could and did drive men toward betrayal. Close associates who had once been loyal allies began weighing personal gain against allegiance, tempted by promises from rivals, law enforcement, or even their own desire for independence. For the first time, Luciano confronted the reality that psychological control, while powerful, could never be absolute. Trust, a foundational pillar of his empire, had limits when confronted with the unpredictable ambitions of men. The circumstances of his downfall were a combination of timing, pressure, and calculated legal strategy by authorities. Investigations into prostitution rings, gambling operations, and labor rackets intensified, with evidence increasingly traced back to Luciano's organization. Witnesses emerged, informants were recruited, and the law began to penetrate the shadows in which his empire had long operated with impunity. Luciano, adept at anticipation and contingency planning, now found himself navigating a legal and social landscape that was closing in. The tools of strategy and diplomacy he had honed over decades were suddenly insufficient against the machinery of the state, whose reach extended beyond street influence and fear. The arrest itself marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in the balance of power. Luciano, who had long been untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable, exposed not only to legal consequences but to the threat of betrayal from within his own organization. Associates faced choices: maintain loyalty and risk retaliation from law enforcement, or cooperate in exchange for leniency, profit, or personal security. The psychological leverage that had once been his greatest asset was now under stress, revealing the fragility inherent in any empire built on human behavior as much as on strategy. Betrayal when it came was both inevitable and illuminating. Some of Luciano's closest lieutenants, calculating the risks and rewards, chose self-preservation over loyalty, the delicate web of influence meticulously constructed through years of observation and negotiation began to fray. These acts of treachery were not only personal setbacks, they were structural challenges threatening to destabilize entire sectors of his empire. Yet even in the face of betrayal, Luciano demonstrated his characteristic psychological acuity. He assessed threats, isolated disloyal elements, and recalibrated alliances to mitigate the damage, showing that even the first tremors of downfall could be managed with intelligence and foresight. The arrest and subsequent exposure also had profound psychological effects on Luciano, a man accustomed to anticipating every move, manipulating every relationship, and controlling nearly every variable. Suddenly faced forces beyond his control. The streets no longer answered to him unconditionally. The law, public scrutiny, and the internal ambitions of his organization created an environment of vulnerability and uncertainty. For the first time, the architecture of power he had so carefully constructed was tested against an unpredictable systemic force that could not be intimidated or negotiated with ease. Yet even amid this pressure, Luciano remained strategically minded, his mind trained to navigate complex networks of influence and human behavior turned toward contingency and adaptation. He understood that physical incarceration did not necessarily equate to a loss of influence. By reinforcing loyalty among trusted lieutenants, structuring communication channels, and exploiting the dependencies he had created within the organization, he maintained a measure of control even as the legal system closed in. His fall, while inevitable in some respects, was mitigated by his ability to anticipate outcomes and manipulate circumstances to preserve both power and influence. The downfall was also a lesson in the duality of power. Luciano had demonstrated that influence, strategy, and psychological mastery could dominate for decades, reshaping an entire criminal ecosystem. Yet these same tools were ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond the underworld, law, politics, and the shifting ambitions of men who had once been loyal. Power, he realized, was not eternal. It required constant reinforcement, adaptation, and humility before circumstances. Even the most sophisticated empire built on vision and intellect was subject to the unpredictable variables of human behavior and societal pressure. The beginning of Luciano's fall serves as a cautionary narrative about the limits of control, the inevitability of external scrutiny, and the fragile nature of loyalty when confronted with survival. It illustrates the tension between ambition and vulnerability, showing that even a master of influence cannot fully escape the consequences of exposure and the dynamics of human psychology. The arrest was more than a legal event, it was a psychological turning point, a moment in which the balance of power he had so carefully managed began to shift, exposing the cracks inherent in any complex empire. In this phase, Luciano's empire, while still formidable, entered a new stage, one in which survival, damage control, and the management of human behavior became paramount. The lessons were profound. No network, however sophisticated, is immune to betrayal. No psychological strategy is infallible, and no empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, is entirely beyond the reach of external forces. This period marked the transition from dominance to vulnerability, a moment in which the genius of his rise would be tested by the pressures of exposure, betrayal, and the inexorable consequences of ambition. Ultimately, the fall begins not with a single violent act or dramatic confrontation, but with the subtle alignment of legal scrutiny, shifting loyalty, and internal weakness. For Luciano, the arrest and ensuing challenges revealed the fragile architecture of power, highlighting both the brilliance of his ascent and the inevitable vulnerabilities that accompany human ambition. Even as he confronted these threats, his mind remained a calculating instrument, assessing, planning, and adapting, a reflection of the same strategic intelligence that had allowed him to dominate the underworld. In the story of Lucky Luciano, the fall begins not as an end but as a complex, psychologically charged transformation, setting the stage for trials that would redefine both his life and the legacy of the empire he had created. The trial of Lucky Luciano was not just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle that captured the imagination of the public, the fascination of the press, and the attention of a nation increasingly aware of the power of organized crime. By the time he faced the courtroom, Luciano had already become a legend in the criminal underworld, a figure whose influence extended far beyond the streets of Brooklyn or the neighborhoods of Manhattan. His arrest had exposed the machinery of his empire, revealing the vast network of operations he controlled, and now the law sought not just to punish him but to make an example of a man who seemed untouchable. The stage was set for a confrontation between myth and reality, a psychological and moral drama that would define his legacy. The courtroom was charged with tension. Reporters, law enforcement officials, politicians, and curious citizens filled every seat, eager to witness the trial of a man whose name had become synonymous with both audacity and fear. The media, Sensing both scandal and drama portrayed Luciano as a master criminal who had manipulated men, money and influence with unparalleled skill. Headlines oscillated between reverence and condemnation, painting a portrait of a man who was simultaneously brilliant, ruthless and morally ambiguous. For the public, the trial was a window into a hidden world of crime, power and psychology, a stage upon which the consequences of ambition and betrayal would be played out in stark relief. Luciano's own demeanor in court was emblematic of the man he had been throughout his rise. Calm, composed and strategic, he understood that perception mattered as much as the legal arguments themselves. Every word, gesture and glance was calculated to convey control, intelligence and defiance without arrogance. Even as prosecutors detailed the extensive scope of his criminal empire, highlighting prostitution rings, gambling operations and labor racketeering, Luciano projected an air of composed authority. This was a man who had spent decades reading people, manipulating behavior and controlling perception, and he continued to exercise these skills in the courtroom, transforming legal scrutiny into a psychological theater. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They sought to dismantle not only Luciano's operations but the very myth of invincibility he had cultivated. Witnesses were called to testify against him, evidence meticulously catalogued to demonstrate the extent of his control and the impact of his crimes. The narrative was clear. Here was a man who had risen above the law, who had manipulated networks, corrupted officials and orchestrated illicit enterprises with near-imperial efficiency. The courtroom became a battlefield, a clash between the structured genius of a criminal strategist and the moral authority of the law. Public sentiment added another layer of complexity. The nation, struggling with the aftershocks of economic depression and the lingering effects of prohibition, was captivated by the trial. To many, Luciano represented both the audacity and the danger of organized crime. He was admired for his intelligence and feared for his ruthlessness, yet the trial also forced a moral reckoning. What does it mean to wield power outside the law? How should society respond to genius employed in service of criminal enterprise? These questions reverberated far beyond the courtroom, turning the trial into a national conversation about morality, ambition, and the consequences of unchecked influence. The psychological dimension of the trial cannot be overstated. Luciano's defense team worked to humanize him, to present a figure capable of reason, loyalty and strategic foresight rather than simply brute criminality. At the same time, the prosecution emphasized his cunning, his manipulation of human behavior and his orchestration of illicit networks. The courtroom became a contest of narratives, a struggle over perception as much as legal fact. For Luciano, the stakes were not only freedom but reputation, how the world would remember him and whether the myth of his strategic brilliance would survive legal condemnation. As proceedings unfolded, the trial revealed the fragility of even the most sophisticated empire. Allies wavered, some cooperating with authorities, others distancing themselves to protect personal interests. The psychological leverage that had allowed Luciano to maintain control over decades of complex operations was now tested under scrutiny and threat. Trust, once an instrument of power, became a liability as men calculated the risks of association with a man facing legal punishment. The courtroom in this sense mirrored the streets he had once dominated, a place where human behavior, ambition and fear intersected with lethal consequences. The sentence that ultimately followed was both dramatic and symbolic. Luciano was convicted and handed a long prison term, a formal acknowledgement by the state that even the most powerful figures were not beyond the reach of law. Yet within the narrative of the trial there was also a paradox. While his freedom was curtailed, his influence remained intact in subtle, enduring ways. His empire, built on networks of loyalty, psychological insight and strategic alliances, did not collapse overnight. Even behind bars, Luciano had cultivated structures capable of continuing operation, demonstrating that the reach of influence could extend beyond physical confinement. The trial also marked a turning point in the public perception of organized crime. No longer were gangsters distant, romanticized figures of folklore. They were strategic, intelligent, and embedded within the social, economic, and political fabric of the nation. Luciano's prosecution illuminated the mechanics of influence, the orchestration of human behavior, and the sophisticated networks that allowed criminal enterprise to thrive. The courtroom became a theater not only of justice but of understanding, a place where the psychological, moral, and structural dimensions of criminal power were laid bare for public scrutiny. In retrospect, the trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal episode. It was a study in human behavior, strategic psychology, and the consequences of ambition. It forced a confrontation between the myth of a man who had reshaped the underworld and the moral, social, and legal realities that sought to contain him. It revealed both the brilliance of his ascent and the vulnerabilities inherent in any empire built on human loyalty, fear, and perception. Even as the sentence was delivered, Luciano's intellect and strategic foresight remained evident, reinforcing the paradox of a man both condemned and admired, imprisoned yet still influential. Ultimately, the trial and sentence were a crucible, a moment that exposed the limits of control, the fragility of loyalty, and the enduring power of perception. Luciano's legal defeat did not erase the genius of his rise, nor did it diminish the lasting impact of His strategies on organized crime instead underscored a fundamental truth about power. Even the most brilliant architects of human networks are subject to forces beyond their control, and the consequences of ambition, deception, and influence are as much psychological as they are legal. The courtroom became both a stage of justice and a mirror reflecting the intricate, often paradoxical nature of human ambition and the complex legacy of a man who had forever changed the landscape of crime in America. Even behind the cold, ironclad walls of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence did not vanish to the untrained eye. Incarceration might seem like the ultimate equalizer, a place where power is stripped and control reduced to the most basic survival instincts. Yet for Luciano, prison was not a terminus of authority but a new arena in which strategy, psychology, and influence could still be exercised, the very qualities that had allowed him to rise above rivals on the streets. Acute observation, manipulation of human behavior, and calculated negotiation remained potent tools within the confines of a cell. Power, he understood, was not merely physical, it was psychological, structural, and relational. From the outset of his imprisonment, Luciano assessed the environment with the same meticulous attention he had applied to the streets. Guards, fellow inmates, prison officials, and administrators were all elements in a system of potential leverage. He observed routines, hierarchies, alliances, and weaknesses, cataloging the behaviors of those around him. The prison became a microcosm of the criminal world he had once dominated on a much larger scale. Factions, influence networks, and unspoken codes of conduct dictated outcomes. Just as they had in Brooklyn, Luciano's genius lay in recognizing that authority and influence were not bound to geography, they were exercised wherever human behavior could be anticipated, directed, and manipulated. Communication was his first instrument of power. Luciano maintained connections with lieutenants and associates on the outside through intermediaries, letters, and carefully placed contacts. These channels allowed him to issue instructions, coordinate operations, and maintain the structure of his empire despite physical confinement. By fostering a sense of continuity and presence, Luciano ensured that the network he had built did not crumble in his absence. His empire, unlike many others, was not dependent on proximity. It was anchored in loyalty, perception, and the careful orchestration of human relationships, all of which transcended walls and bars. Within the prison itself, Luciano's influence extended to both fellow inmates and staff. He quickly identified those who could be persuaded, intimidated, or incentivized to act in ways that supported his objectives. Through subtle negotiation, strategic alliances, and when necessary, psychological pressure, he cultivated a network of reliability. Even in a setting designed to neutralize individual power, Luciano turned the system's dynamics to his advantage. Guards were managed, rivals were neutralized, and collaborators were integrated into a hierarchy that mirrored the organization outside. In essence, prison became another theater for the exercise of his strategic genius. Luciano also leveraged his growing reputation as both a strategist and a negotiator. The mythos of his street dominance preceded him, and the perception of power was as important as its actual execution. Fellow inmates recognized his intelligence and influence, while prison staff, often wary of the social dynamics within the facility, treated his words and intentions with deference. By maintaining this aura of authority, Luciano could extend control indirectly, demonstrating that even physical constraints could not diminish psychological dominance. Influence, he knew, was often more enduring than violence, more persuasive than intimidation, and in many cases more powerful than legality itself. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Luciano's post-incarceration power was its strategic adaptability. He understood that the rules of engagement in prison differed from those on the streets, and he adjusted accordingly. Subtlety, patience, and psychological acuity became paramount. Every interaction was calculated, a word here, a favor there, a carefully timed demonstration of loyalty or threat. In this environment, impulsive aggression could provoke retaliation or scrutiny, while thoughtful manipulation produced sustainable influence. Luciano's ability to calibrate his approach to the constraints of the prison system illustrated the same strategic intelligence that had defined his rise to power outside its walls. The continuity of his empire also underscored the depth of his planning. Luciano had long understood that power to endure must be institutional rather than personal. He built structures, distributed authority, and nurtured loyal lieutenants who could execute his vision with fidelity. This foresight ensured that even incarceration did not dissolve the intricate web of influence, resources, and operations he had meticulously crafted. Luciano's presence, though physically constrained, remained felt throughout the underworld, a testament to his understanding that control was as much about systems as it was about individual action. Psychologically, prison offered another advantage, perspective removed from the immediate pressures of street violence and operational logistics. Luciano could observe, analyze, and plan on a level of abstraction impossible in the chaos of daily criminal enterprise. He studied the responses of allies, enemies, and institutions, refining strategies for negotiation, manipulation, and adaptation. Every interaction was an experiment, every reaction data. In many ways, incarceration became an incubator for intellectual and strategic growth, a place where patience and observation replaced impulse and immediacy. Despite the constraints, Luciano's adaptability extended to political and social contexts as well. He recognized opportunities to leverage his knowledge and network in ways that could influence broader societal structures. During World War II, for instance, he provided intelligence and assistance to government authorities in exchange for leniency, a calculated engagement that demonstrated his ability to manipulate both perception and circumstance to maintain and even expand influence. The interplay between his empire, the legal system, and broader political forces highlighted his mastery not just of street-level strategy but of the complex interdependencies of power, loyalty, and survival. Ultimately, Luciano's exercise of power behind bars illuminates a central truth about his genius. Influence is not defined by freedom, territory, or even direct control. It is defined by the ability to shape perception, manage human behavior, and maintain structural continuity under conditions of constraint. Through strategic foresight, psychological acuity, and careful orchestration of both relationships and operations, Luciano demonstrated that the architecture of an empire could extend beyond walls, jurisdiction, and even physical liberty. In the narrative of his life, this period serves as both a continuation and a transformation of his story. The streets had taught him strategy, observation, and negotiation. Alliances had shown him the power of loyalty and influence. Incarceration tested his adaptability, patience, and psychological control. Through it all, Luciano remained a master of systems and human behavior, proving that true power lies not in circumstance but in the mind, capable of manipulating, anticipating, and orchestrating the world around it. Even in confinement, he remained a strategist, a manipulator, and a lead-era man whose empire, though challenged, had not been conquered. The release of Lucky Luciano from prison did not restore him to the streets of New York. Instead, it thrust him into a new reality. Exile, deported to Italy in 1946, Luciano entered a country familiar by heritage but foreign in circumstance. The bustling neighborhoods of Brooklyn, the alliances he had forged, and the empire he had meticulously built were now out of reach. Italy, still recovering from the devastation of World War II, presented a landscape of instability, political turmoil, economic hardship, and fragmented criminal networks. For a man whose identity had been defined by control, power, and influence, exile was both a loss and a challenge, forcing him to adapt, reflect, and redefine the meaning of authority. Despite the geographical and political constraints, Luciano quickly realized that influence need not be tied to territory. His reputation, earned through decades of strategic brilliance, provided leverage that could be converted into opportunity. He reconnected with networks in Italy, Europe, and across the Atlantic, maintaining lines of communication with the American mafia and advising operations from afar. Exile became a theater for strategic oversight where patience, subtlety, and negotiation replaced the immediate direct authority of his earlier years. Through careful cultivation of relationships, he demonstrated that the architecture of power could survive even the most severe physical displacement. Exile also offered Luciano space for introspection. Removed from the immediate pressures of empire building, he confronted the paradoxes of his life, ambition and morality, loyalty and betrayal, influence and vulnerability. He reflected on the psychological tools that had enabled his rise, the manipulation of fear, the orchestration of loyalty, and the calculated distribution of power, and observed how these mechanisms could be applied in new contexts. Far from self-recrimination, his reflections were analytical. He evaluated the consequences of decisions, the fragility of empires, and the enduring patterns of human behavior that underlie all networks of influence. Socially and operationally, Luciano remained engaged. He interacted selectively with the Italian underworld, advised American associates, and leveraged opportunities to influence both legal and illicit enterprises. His cooperation with government authorities during and after World War I, providing intelligence and facilitating strategic alliances, highlighted his pragmatic approach to power. Influence could be negotiated, exchanged, and maintained even from a position of exile. These actions reaffirmed his ability to transform constraints into advantage, sustaining relevance despite the limits imposed by circumstance. Exile also illuminated Luciano's philosophical transformation. Power, he observed, was neither absolute nor permanent. Influence depended on perception, strategic foresight, and human behavior. Loyalty was fragile, alliances were contingent, and even the most sophisticated systems were vulnerable to external forces. Yet within these constraints he discovered a new form of control, one rooted in patience, intellect, and subtle manipulation. He had become a thinker of power, analyzing the patterns, motivations, and dynamics that governed human networks rather than relying solely on direct action. In these final years, Luciano's life reflected the tension between adaptation and legacy. While he could no longer walk the streets he had dominated, he remained an architect of influence, guiding operations, shaping strategy and observing the ongoing evolution of the networks he had created. His exile underscores a profound truth: the essence of power lies not in territory or proximity but in the ability to anticipate, manipulate and orchestrate human behavior across systems and circumstances. Ultimately, Luciano's exile and endgame are a testament to resilience, intellect and adaptability. He confronted the limitations imposed by law, geography and time, yet continued to exercise influence, reflect on the mechanisms of control and shape the broader criminal and social landscape. Exile paradoxically became a stage for his strategic mind to operate unimpeded by the chaos of the streets, allowing him to consolidate lessons learned, refine approaches and maintain a lasting imprint on the criminal world. In the narrative of his life, exile represents both the vulnerability and enduring brilliance of a man who had forever transformed organized crime, proving that true power is as much psychological and relational as it is physical. Lucky Luciano's influence extends far beyond the streets of New York. He reshaped the very architecture of organized crime. Before his rise, the mafia was fragmented, chaotic, and ruled by impulsive violence. Luciano transformed it into a disciplined, strategic enterprise, introducing systems of governance, alliances, and hierarchical structure that mirrored corporate organization. Central to his legacy was the Commission, a council of family leaders designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and coordinate operations. This innovation reduced conflict, maximized efficiency and formalized decision-making, creating a template for generations of criminal enterprises. Beyond structure, Luciano's genius lay in understanding human behavior. He recognized that loyalty, fear and ambition were as powerful as wealth or force. By calibrating incentives, rewards and consequences, he maintained control over sprawling networks while neutralizing internal threats. This psychological mastery became a model for modern crime, demonstrating that influence could be subtle, calculated and enduring. Even in exile, Luciano continued to guide networks, showing that power transcends geography when systems and perception are managed strategically. His legacy also informs criminal psychology. Law enforcement and scholars study his methods to understand leadership, manipulation and resilience in high-stakes networks. Luciano's life illustrates that influence is structural and relational, not only physical, and that strategic foresight and adaptability are the ultimate tools of power. He was both condemned and admired, feared yet respected, leaving a blueprint for modern organized crime that blends intellect, psychology and systemic strategy. The story of Lucky Luciano is a study in contrast: myth versus man, legend versus reality. Popular culture paints him as the untouchable kingpin of the American underworld, a figure of audacity, violence and brilliance, yet behind the myth was a man shaped by circumstance, poverty and immigrant struggle, a strategist who understood human behavior, loyalty and perception better than any rival. His genius was not just in power but in psychology, in the orchestration of systems and in the subtle management of fear and influence. Luciano's life also highlights the fragility of control. Arrest, trial, imprisonment and exile exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in even the most sophisticated empire. The streets he once dominated, the alliances he nurtured and the networks he orchestrated were always subject to betrayal, law enforcement and shifting circumstances. Even so, his resilience, adaptability and foresight allowed him to maintain influence long after his direct control ended. Ultimately, the myth captivates, but the man instructs. Luciano's life teaches that power is relational, influence is strategic and human behavior is the ultimate currency. His story closes not with moral clarity but with complexity and reflection, showing that genius and ambition are inseparable from vulnerability and consequence. The legacy of Lucky Luciano lies in this dualism, a man whose life and myth illuminate the enduring dynamics of power, loyalty and human ambition, offering lessons far beyond the underworld he once ruled.